Judge shocked. Recognizes childhood friend on trial. What happens next stuns the courtroom. Have you ever faced a moment where the past collides with the present, forcing you to make an impossible choice? In today's story, a respected judge finds herself in the middle of the most challenging case of her career, not because of the evidence or the witnesses, but because of the person on trial, a woman accused of embezzlement, a woman whose name holds a history far deeper than the courtroom walls. What would you do if the accused wasn't just another defendant, but your childhood best friend? The courtroom buzzed with muted conversations as Judge Meredith Shaw adjusted her robe, the weight of the day pressing on her shoulders. It was another busy morning at the Cook County Courthouse in Chicago, and the list of cases promised a long day ahead. The room carried the familiar scent of old wood and polished leather, a setting Meredith had grown accustomed to in her 10 years on the bench. The gavel felt steady in her hand, a symbol of the order she was sworn to uphold. The bailiff's voice echoed through the room. All rise. The Honorable Judge Shaw presiding. Meredith entered the courtroom, her dark hair neatly tied back, her sharp gaze scanning the room as she took her seat. She nodded to the bailiff, signaling for everyone to be seated. The clatter of chairs echoed for a moment before silence settled in. Her clerk handed her the file for the next case. Case number 3124B, State of Illinois versus Alice Morgan. The name jolted her. Alice Morgan. Her breath hitched, but she quickly masked her reaction, her expression remaining stoic. Could it really be the same Alice? It had been nearly 2 decades since she had last seen her childhood best friend, the girl who had shared her dreams of escaping the struggles of their South Side neighborhood. Meredith forced her hand to remain steady as she opened the file. The defendant entered the courtroom, flanked by her attorney. The moment Meredith's eyes met the woman standing at the defense table, time seemed to freeze. It was her. The same deep brown eyes, the same high cheekbones, though now they were framed by worry lines and a weariness that hadn't been there before. Alice looked older, worn down by life, or perhaps by the gravity of the charges she faced. Meredith's heart sank. Memories came rushing back like a flood. The laughter they had shared as kids, their late-night talks about their future, and the bitter argument that had driven them apart. Alice had always been the bold one, the one who took risks, while Meredith had been the cautious planner. Their paths had diverged when Alice's ambition began to overshadow her morals. "Miss Morgan, please take your seat," the bailiff instructed. Alice complied, her movements stiff and hesitant. Her attorney whispered something to her, but Alice's eyes never left Meredith. The recognition in her gaze was unmistakable, and for a brief moment, their shared history hung heavy in the air between them. Meredith cleared her throat, her voice steady despite the turmoil within. "The court will now come to order. This is the matter of the state of Illinois versus Alice Morgan, charged with embezzlement and fraud." Her words felt foreign, as though someone else were speaking. She glanced briefly at the file in front of her, the stark black letters on the page detailing the accusations. Embezzlement of funds from the Hope Haven Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to housing homeless families. The case had already drawn public outrage. The media had painted Alice as a villain, a once successful businesswoman who had betrayed the trust of those in need. As the prosecutor began to outline the charges, Meredith's mind struggled to reconcile the woman before her with the girl she had once known. Alice had been fearless, ambitious, and fiercely loyal. What had brought her to this point? Her thoughts were interrupted as Alice's attorney rose to speak. "Your Honor, my client pleads not guilty to all charges. We maintain that Miss Morgan has been wrongfully accused and is the victim of a setup orchestrated by her former business partner." Meredith kept her face neutral, though the defense's argument didn't surprise her. Alice's charm and resourcefulness had always been her greatest assets, but Meredith couldn't ignore the evidence presented in the file: falsified financial records, suspicious wire transfers, and extravagant purchases made with foundation funds. "Thank you, Counselor," Meredith said, her tone measured. "The court will proceed with the preliminary hearing." As the proceedings continued, Meredith found herself grappling with conflicting emotions. She was a judge, bound by her oath to uphold justice. Yet here was a woman who had once been like a sister to her, now sitting on the opposite side of the bench. The weight of her responsibility felt heavier than ever. During a brief recess, Meredith retreated to her chambers, needing a moment to collect herself. She sank into her chair, her hands gripping the edges of her desk. The room was quiet save for the faint hum of the courthouse air conditioning. Her mind swirled with memories. Alice standing up for her against school bullies, the two of them dreaming of brighter futures, and the last heated argument that had shattered their friendship. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. It was her clerk. "Judge Shaw, we're ready to reconvene." Meredith straightened her shoulders, her resolve hardening. She had a job to do, and she couldn't let personal feelings cloud her judgment. Taking a deep breath, she stood and returned to the courtroom, ready to face whatever came next. As she re-entered, she caught Alice watching her. There was something in her eyes. Was it defiance, or perhaps a plea for understanding? Whatever it was, Meredith couldn't afford to dwell on it. The law didn't allow for personal ties. Not here, not now. "Court is back in session," Meredith declared, her voice ringing with authority. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that this case was about to test her in ways she had never imagined. The courtroom fell into a solemn silence as the prosecution resumed presenting its case. Meredith Shaw sat tall in her judge's chair, her gaze fixed on the prosecutor as he detailed the accusations. Yet her mind felt like a stormy sea, each word stirring memories she had buried long ago. "Your Honor," the prosecutor began, pacing the room. "The evidence clearly shows that Miss Morgan knowingly and deliberately embezzled funds from the Hope Haven Foundation. We have records of forged documents and bank transfers that lead directly to her account." Meredith's fingers tightened around the gavel in her hand. She forced herself to focus on the present, even as echoes of the past whispered in her ear. She remembered Alice's determination as a teenager, the way she always pushed boundaries. They'd been a team once. Alice would dare, and Meredith would caution. Together they balanced each other, or so Meredith had thought. The defense attorney stood, his voice smooth and confident. "Your Honor, the prosecution's argument relies heavily on circumstantial evidence. My client has been an exemplary businesswoman for years, and we intend to prove that she was framed by a former associate who had access to the same financial records." Meredith nodded, acknowledging the point, but her expression remained impassive. "Proceed," she said, her voice firm but neutral. Inside, her chest tightened. The defense had a challenging task ahead. The evidence against Alice was damning. As the prosecutor called his first witness, Meredith's attention snapped to the present. A former accountant from the foundation took the stand, a middle-aged man with a nervous demeanor. He avoided looking at Alice as he adjusted his glasses and began answering questions. "Mr. Grayson," the prosecutor began, "can you confirm that you worked for the Hope Haven Foundation during the period in question?" "Yes," the man said, his voice trembling slightly. "I handled financial records for the organization for 5 years. And during that time, did you notice any irregularities in the foundation's accounts?" Grayson hesitated, glancing at Alice before responding. "Yes, around 2 years ago, I noticed discrepancies in the financial statements. Large sums of money were being transferred to accounts that weren't listed as foundation-approved vendors." The prosecutor stepped closer. "And were these accounts traced back to Miss Morgan?" "Yes," Grayson confirmed, his voice barely above a whisper. "They were in her name." A murmur rippled through the courtroom, but Meredith swiftly brought her gavel down. "Order in the court," she said, her voice cutting through the noise. Her stomach churned. The weight of the evidence was undeniable. Yet the Alice she once knew wouldn't have needed to steal. She'd been resourceful, intelligent, and ambitious, but never reckless. The defense attorney rose, his movements calculated. "Mr. Grayson, during your time at the foundation, did other employees have access to these accounts?" Grayson hesitated. "Yes, but..." The defense cut him off. "So it's possible these transactions were made by someone else using Miss Morgan's name, correct?" Grayson shifted uncomfortably. "I suppose it's possible, but unlikely." The attorney leaned in, pressing the point. "Unlikely is not proof. Is it possible that a disgruntled employee or an external hacker could have forged these transactions?" The prosecutor objected, but Meredith waved her hand. "Overruled. Answer the question, Mr. Grayson." Grayson sighed. "Yes, it's possible." The defense attorney smiled faintly. No further questions. Meredith called a brief recess, and as the courtroom emptied, Alice remained seated, her eyes fixed on Meredith. There was a flicker of something there, desperation perhaps. Meredith averted her gaze and retreated to her chambers, where the silence enveloped her like a suffocating blanket. She sat at her desk, her hands trembling slightly as she removed her robe. This case was unlike anything she'd faced before. It wasn't just about the law, it was personal. She hadn't spoken to Alice since they were both barely 20. The last conversation they had was etched in her memory, a bitter argument over Alice's risky decision to partner with a shady investor. Meredith had warned her, pleaded with her to reconsider, but Alice had dismissed her concerns. The fallout had been swift and irrevocable. A knock interrupted her thoughts. It was her clerk, Judge Shaw. "Miss Morgan has requested to speak with you privately." Meredith stiffened. Her first instinct was to refuse. This was highly irregular. But then she thought of Alice's eyes, the silent plea they carried. Against her better judgment, she nodded. "Send her in." Alice entered, her posture guarded. The door closed behind her, leaving them alone for the first time in nearly 20 years. The room felt too small, the air too thick. "Meredith," Alice said softly, her voice cracking. "It's been a long time." Meredith folded her arms, keeping her expression neutral. "Yes, it has. What do you want, Alice?" Alice flinched at the coldness in her tone, but quickly composed herself. "I need you to believe me. I didn't do this." Meredith's eyes narrowed. "You're asking me to abandon my duty and ignore the evidence presented in court? You of all people should know better." "I'm asking you to remember who I am," Alice said, stepping closer. "Who I was. We dreamed of escaping the South Side together, Meredith. You know me." Meredith's voice hardened. "I thought I did. But people change, Alice. I've seen it too many times to ignore." Alice's shoulders slumped, her confidence faltering. "Maybe I made mistakes, but I didn't do this. You have to believe me." Meredith's gaze softened for a brief moment before she caught herself. "Belief isn't enough, Alice. The truth will come out in court. That's the only thing I can promise." Alice nodded, her face a mixture of frustration and defeat. "You were always the righteous one," she muttered before leaving. As the door closed behind her, Meredith sank into her chair, the weight of her words heavy in the air. She didn't know if she could trust Alice, but one thing was certain. The road ahead would only grow more difficult. The courtroom resumed after the recess, its atmosphere heavier than before. Judge Meredith Shaw sat with her hands clasped in front of her, her mind swirling with a mixture of emotion. She had spent the break trying to suppress the memory of Alice's plea, but her words in chambers lingered like a stubborn shadow. Meredith pushed it aside. She couldn't allow her personal feelings to cloud her judgment. The prosecutor called his next witness, a forensic accountant, a trim man in his 40s. He approached the stand with the kind of confidence that only came with years of expertise. After being sworn in, he adjusted his tie and began to speak. "Your Honor," he started, addressing Meredith directly before turning to the courtroom. "I was hired to audit the Hope Haven Foundation after concerns of financial discrepancies were raised by the board. My team and I conducted a thorough investigation of their accounts." "And what did you find?" the prosecutor asked, standing a few steps away with his hands clasped behind his back. "We discovered that over the span of 18 months, approximately $2.3 million was siphoned from the foundation's funds into an account registered under the name Ellison Holdings, which belongs to the defendant, Miss Alice Morgan." A sharp intake of breath rippled through the courtroom. Alice, seated beside her attorney, kept her gaze fixed on the desk in front of her, her jaw tight. Meredith noted the subtle tension in her former friend's posture, but remained focused on the testimony. "Did you investigate whether anyone else had access to these funds?" the prosecutor asked. "Yes," the accountant replied. "We analyzed all digital trails, including logins, IP addresses, and timestamps. All the activity leading to the misappropriation of funds originated from devices linked to Miss Morgan's personal accounts." The defense attorney stood abruptly. "Objection, Your Honor. The witness is presenting conclusions without providing evidence that these devices weren't accessed by another party." Meredith's gavel tapped lightly. "Sustained. The witness may clarify." The forensic accountant adjusted his glasses to address the defense's concern. The IP addresses were tracked to Miss Morgan's personal home and office. There was no indication of external breaches into her network. The defense attorney frowned, but remained seated. Meredith studied Alice, whose expression hadn't changed. There was no outburst of denial, no visible sign of panic, just a controlled, almost resigned calm. It was a far cry from the fiery, quick-tempered Alice Meredith had grown up with. As the accountant's testimony continued, Meredith's mind drifted briefly to the last time she and Alice had spoken. They had been 21, sitting on the worn couch in Alice's tiny apartment. Alice had been ecstatic, telling Meredith about a business opportunity she couldn't pass up, a partnership with a man who promised rapid success. "You don't even know him," Meredith had argued, her voice tinged with frustration. What if he's just using you? You could lose everything, Alice. Alice had waved her off. You're always so cautious, Meredith. That's why you'll never get anywhere. You're too afraid to take risks. And you're reckless, Meredith had shot back. One of these days, it's going to catch up with you. The argument had escalated. Harsh words exchanged, each of them cutting deep. The last thing Meredith had said before slamming the door was, "If you keep this up, don't come crying to me when it all falls apart." She'd regretted those words more than once over the years, but Alice had never reached out, and neither had she. The prosecutor finished his questioning, and the defense attorney began cross-examining the accountant, attempting to poke holes in the evidence. While their exchange unfolded, Meredith found herself studying Alice. The woman sitting before her was a far cry from the ambitious, defiant friend she had once known. The years had carved lines of weariness into her face, but there was something else, something deeper, regret perhaps. When the accountant was dismissed, the prosecutor announced their next piece of evidence, surveillance footage. The courtroom grew still as the lights dimmed and a screen descended from the ceiling. This footage, the prosecutor explained, was captured by security cameras at a bank where a key transfer was made. The timestamp matches the transaction in question. The video began to play on the screen. A woman resembling Alice entered the bank, her movements precise and purposeful. She approached a teller, handed over documents, and waited as the teller processed the transaction. Moments later, she accepted a receipt and left. The prosecutor paused the video, pointing at the screen. "Your Honor, the woman in this footage is the defendant, Miss Alice Morgan." The defense attorney stood, his voice firm. "Objection. The footage is grainy, and the individual's face is partially obscured. This is not definitive proof." Meredith leaned forward, her gaze narrowing as she studied the video. The resemblance was undeniable, but the defense had a point. The footage, while compelling, wasn't airtight. "Objection sustained," Meredith said. "The jury will weigh this evidence accordingly." As the trial continued, Meredith found herself increasingly conflicted. The evidence against Alice was mounting, but the defense's arguments, while tenuous, sowed seeds of doubt. Could Alice really be guilty? Or was she, as she claimed, being set up? That evening, Meredith returned to her chambers, exhausted. She sat at her desk, her fingers tracing the edge of a photo frame. Inside was a picture of her younger self with Alice, taken at a summer carnival. They were grinning, their arms around each other, unaware of the trials life would bring. Her clerk knocked softly on the door. "Judge Shaw." The bailiff mentioned Miss Morgan requested another meeting. Meredith hesitated, then shook her head. "Not tonight. Tell her I can't." As the door closed, Meredith leaned back in her chair, her thoughts heavy. She wasn't sure what was more troubling, the possibility that Alice had committed the crimes or the realization that she might have no choice but to deliver a verdict that would sever the last remaining tie to her past. The line between justice and emotion was growing blurrier by the day, and Meredith feared what lay ahead. The courtroom hummed with subdued tension as the trial resumed the following morning. The prosecution's case was solidifying, piece by piece, as more witnesses and evidence painted a damning picture of Alice Morgan. Yet for all the precision and detail presented, Meredith couldn't shake the sense that something was missing, an elusive thread woven into the fabric of the case that refused to unravel. Meredith took her seat, scanning the courtroom. The gallery was packed, as it had been since the trial began. Reporters sat in the back rows, pens poised over notebooks. Members of the Hope Haven Foundation board were clustered near the front, their faces grim. Alice sat at the defense table, her attorney whispering to her, but she looked detached, staring ahead as if lost in thought. "All rise," the bailiff intoned, his voice booming. The room fell silent as Meredith entered, her black robe swishing faintly as she moved. "The court is now in session," Meredith said firmly, her voice carrying the authority she had worked years to hone. "Prosecution, you may call your next witness." The prosecutor rose, a man in his mid-50s with salt and pepper hair and a demeanor that commanded respect. "Your Honor, the state calls Mr. Arthur Davies to the stand." A tall, well-dressed man stepped forward, his tailored suit and polished shoes a sharp contrast to the gravity of the charges being discussed. As he took the oath and sat, Meredith studied him carefully. Arthur Davies was the former CFO of Ellison Enterprises, the company Alice had built from the ground up. According to the case file, He had resigned under murky circumstances shortly before the embezzlement came to light. Mr. Davies, the prosecutor began, can you describe your role at Ellison Enterprises during the time in question? I was the chief financial officer, Davies replied smoothly. His voice was calm, practiced, a man accustomed to speaking in front of others. I oversaw all financial operations, including budgets, expenditures, and compliance with legal regulations. And were you aware of any irregularities in the company's financial dealings during your tenure? Davies hesitated, his eyes darting briefly to Alice before he continued. Yes, toward the end of my time at Ellison Enterprises, I began to notice transactions that didn't align with the company's standard practices. Large sums of money were being moved into personal accounts. The prosecutor pressed further. And did you bring these concerns to Miss Morgan's attention? I did, Davies said, nodding. I scheduled a meeting with her to discuss the discrepancies. She assured me it was a misunderstanding and that everything would be resolved. And was it resolved? Davies' lips tightened. No. Instead, I found myself increasingly excluded from key decisions. Eventually, I felt I had no choice but to resign. Alice's attorney stood abruptly. Objection, Your Honor. Speculation. Mr. Davies is insinuating motives without concrete evidence. Sustained, Meredith said, her tone clipped. Mr. Davies, please limit your testimony to factual accounts. The prosecutor adjusted his stance, undeterred. Mr. Davies, did you report your concerns to the authorities or the board of directors? Davies shook his head. No. At the time, I didn't have enough evidence to substantiate my claims, and I was concerned about potential legal repercussions. The courtroom buzzed faintly with murmurs, but Meredith silenced them with a firm strike of her gavel. Order in the court. As Davies stepped down from the stand, Meredith's gaze shifted to Alice. For the first time, she saw a crack in her carefully composed facade. Alice's hands were clasped tightly on the table, her knuckles white, and her eyes betrayed a flicker of fear. It was subtle, but to Meredith, it was telling. The defense attorney rose, adjusting his tie with deliberate precision. Your Honor, I'd like to call the defendant, Miss Alice Morgan, to the stand. The gallery erupted in whispers, but Meredith didn't hesitate. Miss Morgan, please approach the stand. Alice stood, her movements measured but tense. As she was sworn in, Meredith felt a strange mix of emotions. The judge in her wanted the truth, the friend in her wanted an explanation, and the skeptic in her wasn't sure she would get either. Miss Morgan, her attorney began. Can you describe your involvement with the Hope Haven Foundation? Alice cleared her throat, her voice steady but low. I've been a board member and major donor for several years. The foundation's mission has always been close to my heart, and I've worked to secure funding and expand its reach. And did you embezzle funds from the foundation, as the prosecution alleges? No, Alice said firmly, her eyes locking with her attorney's. I did not. The attorney nodded, pacing slowly. Can you explain the transactions that have been linked to your accounts? Alice hesitated. I trusted people I shouldn't have. I delegated financial responsibilities to individuals who I thought had the foundation's best interests at heart. Clearly, I was wrong. Are you suggesting that someone else committed these acts under your name? Yes, Alice said, her voice trembling slightly. I believe I was set up. Meredith watched Alice closely, searching for any sign of deception. The Alice she knew had always been a skilled speaker, able to convince anyone of anything. But there was something different now, a vulnerability that seemed genuine. Or was it just another act? The prosecutor cross-examined her, his tone sharp. Miss Morgan, you claim you were unaware of these transactions, yet evidence shows you personally authorized several of them. How do you explain that? Alice's composure faltered. I trusted my CFO to handle the details. He told me what needed approval, and I signed off based on his recommendations. Do you expect this court to believe that a seasoned businesswoman like yourself wouldn't thoroughly review multi-million-dollar transactions? Alice paused, her voice catching. I made a mistake. I didn't ask enough questions. But I didn't steal that money. The prosecutor leaned closer. Miss Morgan, isn't it true that your lifestyle, including luxury vacations and high-end purchases, was funded by the stolen money? No. Alice snapped, her voice rising. Those expenses were legitimate, tied to business trips and events. I have the receipts to prove it. The prosecutor smirked. Receipts we have yet to see. As the day wore on, Meredith felt the gap between her and Alice widening. The evidence pointed to guilt, but there were enough inconsistencies to leave room for doubt. Alice's testimony ended with her returning to the defense table, her shoulders slumped as if the weight of the world rested on them. When the court adjourned for the day, Meredith remained seated, watching as Alice was escorted out. Their eyes met briefly, and in that fleeting moment, Meredith thought she saw something, an apology, a plea, or perhaps a challenge. She couldn't be sure. Alone in her chambers that evening, Meredith stared at the framed photo of them as teenagers. For the first time, she felt the fractures in her own resolve. Could she truly remain impartial when the person on trial was a living reminder of everything she had once believed in? Or would her judgment be forever colored by the weight of their shared past? The answers felt as distant as the girl in the photograph, smiling beside a friend she no longer recognized. The next morning dawned gray and cold, with a biting wind that howled through the city streets. Meredith Shaw stood by her office window, staring out at the dense skyline of Chicago. She clutched a cup of black coffee, the warmth spreading through her hands as she tried to ground herself. Today would be pivotal. The prosecution was expected to rest its case, and the defense would begin theirs. Each step brought them closer to a verdict, but for Meredith, the journey felt increasingly like walking a tightrope between her past and her duty. Her chambers were quiet except for the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. A knock broke the silence, followed by her clerk poking her head inside. "Judge Shaw, court will convene in 15 minutes. Meredith nodded. "Thank you, I'll be out shortly." As the door closed, she exhaled slowly and set her coffee down. The image of Alice on the witness stand yesterday lingered in her mind. There had been a fire in Alice's eyes, a desperate attempt to convince the courtroom, or perhaps herself, that she was innocent. The same fire Meredith remembered from years ago when Alice had fought tooth and nail for her dreams. But fire could consume just as easily as it could light the way. The courtroom filled quickly, the usual mix of reporters, spectators, and legal teams taking their places. Alice entered with her attorney, her face carefully neutral, though her fingers fidgeted with the edge of her jacket. Meredith noticed the small gesture, a subtle crack in her composed exterior. "All rise," the bailiff called, his voice steady. Meredith entered, her robe flowing behind her, and took her seat. "The court is now in session. Prosecution, you may proceed." The prosecutor stood, addressing the jury with his characteristic confidence. "Your Honor, the state would like to submit its final piece of evidence. A series of emails recovered from Miss Morgan's personal and professional accounts." A stack of documents was handed to the clerk, who distributed copies to the defense and the judge. Meredith adjusted her glasses as she scanned the pages. The emails were detailed and damning, outlining communications between Alice and various associates. One in particular caught Meredith's eye. From Alice Morgan to Arthur Davies. Subject: Fund transfers. Arthur, make sure the transfer to the offshore account goes through by Friday. Use the foundation's account to cover it and log it as a vendor payment. Keep this between us. Alice. The courtroom murmured as the prosecutor highlighted the message. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this email demonstrates clear intent to embezzle funds and conceal the transaction. This is not an innocent mistake. This is premeditated fraud." Meredith's pulse quickened as she continued reading. There were other emails, requests to adjust financial records, instructions to mislabel transactions, all signed by Alice. The evidence was overwhelming, yet something about it didn't sit right. The tone of the messages was cold, calculated, and impersonal, unlike the Alice she remembered. The defense attorney rose, visibly perturbed. "Your Honor, the defense contends that these emails are fabricated. We have reason to believe that someone else accessed Miss Morgan's accounts and authored these messages. Do you have evidence to support this claim?" Meredith asked, her tone firm. The attorney hesitated. "Not at this time, Your Honor, but we intend to present our case as the trial progresses." "Very well," Meredith said, suppressing the doubt creeping into her thoughts. "The jury will consider the prosecution's evidence and the defense's argument when deliberating." The defense began its case in the afternoon, calling a series of witnesses who spoke to Alice's character and dedication to the foundation. Former employees described her as passionate and driven, though some admitted she could be demanding. Her attorney painted a picture of a woman whose trust in others had been exploited. But the real test came when Alice was called to the stand again. This time, her attorney guided her through a more personal narrative. "Alice," the attorney began, "can you tell the court why you became involved with the Hope Haven Foundation?" Alice exhaled, her voice soft but steady. I grew up in a neighborhood where homelessness was a constant reality. I saw families struggle, kids going to bed hungry, parents working themselves to exhaustion just to keep a roof over their heads. I wanted to change that. That's why I started donating and eventually joined the board. And did you benefit financially from your involvement with the foundation? No, Alice said firmly. Every penny I earned came from my own business ventures. I saw the foundation as a way to give back, not to take. The attorney nodded, pacing slowly. What about the emails presented by the prosecution? How do you explain them? Alice's jaw tightened. I didn't write them. Someone else must have accessed my accounts. And who would do that? I don't know, Alice admitted, her voice faltering. But Arthur Davies, the prosecution's star witness, had access to those accounts. He handled all the financial operations. As Alice spoke, Meredith studied her closely. Her words carried conviction, but there was a tension in her shoulders, a slight tremor in her hands. Was it guilt, fear, or something else entirely? When the defense rested for the day, Meredith called for the court to adjourn. As the room emptied, she lingered, her thoughts churning. The evidence against Alice was compelling, but the defense's claims couldn't be dismissed outright. If there was even a sliver of truth to Alice's story, Meredith owed it to herself and to justice to consider every angle. Back in her chambers, she reviewed the emails again, noting the phrasing and timing. Something felt off, but she couldn't put her finger on it. The Alice she knew wasn't cold or detached. Had she changed so much, or was someone else pulling the strings? A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Her clerk peeked in, looking hesitant. Judge Shaw, Miss Morgan has requested another private meeting. Meredith hesitated, her mind racing. Allowing another meeting was highly irregular, but the look in her clerk's eyes suggested urgency. Send her in, Meredith said at last. Moments later, Alice entered, her expression raw and unguarded. She closed the door behind her, standing awkwardly near the edge of the desk. Meredith, she said, her voice trembling. I know I'm not supposed to ask this, but do you believe me? The question hung in the air, heavy and unanswerable. Meredith met her gaze, searching for the truth in those familiar eyes. But all she saw was a woman teetering on the edge of something she couldn't yet define. I believe in justice, Alice, Meredith replied softly, her words carefully measured. And I believe the truth has a way of coming out. Alice's lips pressed into a thin line, disappointment flickering across her face. I just hope it's not too late when it does. She turned and left, leaving Meredith alone with the weight of her words. As the door clicked shut, Meredith stared at the pile of evidence on her desk, the questions swirling in her mind louder than ever. Was Alice a victim of circumstance or a master manipulator? The answer, whatever it was, felt agonizingly out of reach. The courtroom was quieter than usual the next morning. The audience, once animated with whispered speculation and note-taking, had settled into a solemn attentiveness. The trial's rhythm had shifted, no longer a methodical presentation of facts, but a slow unearthing of something more complicated. Alice's defense was unraveling inch by inch, but in Meredith Shaw's mind, the puzzle felt far from complete. Meredith sat at the bench, her face composed, though her thoughts were anything but. Every piece of evidence, every testimony, every flicker of emotion on Alice's face was etched into her memory, as if replaying would make the truth clearer. Yet clarity remained elusive. All rise, the bailiff called. Meredith entered the courtroom and took her seat. Her robe felt heavier today, the weight of justice pressing against her shoulders. Court is now in session, she announced, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. Defense, you may proceed. Alice's attorney stood. His suit, perfectly pressed, gave the impression of confidence, but there was an undercurrent of desperation in his movements. He cleared his throat, then gestured toward the door. Your Honor, he began. The defense calls Miss Elizabeth Morgan to the stand. A murmur swept through the gallery. Elizabeth Morgan, Alice's younger sister. Meredith's eyes flicked to Alice, who sat at the defense table, her expression unreadable. Alice had mentioned Elizabeth once during their childhood, but Meredith had never met her. Now, as the courtroom door opened, a slender woman in her early 30s stepped forward, her features similar to Alice's but softer, less worn by time. Elizabeth took the oath and settled into the witness stand. She avoided eye contact with Alice, her gaze fixed firmly on the defense attorney. Miss Morgan, the attorney began. Can you tell the court about your role in your sister's business affairs? Elizabeth hesitated. I worked as her assistant for a few years. And during that time, were you privy to her financial dealings? Yes, Elizabeth replied, her voice soft but clear. I handled schedules, travel arrangements, and sometimes minor bookkeeping. The attorney leaned forward slightly. Were you aware of any irregularities in those financial dealings? Elizabeth's hands fidgeted in her lap. I noticed things that didn't add up. Transfers that didn't match the foundation's budget. Expenses that weren't accounted for. When I asked Alice about them, she told me to stay out of it. A gasp rippled through the gallery, and Meredith felt her chest tighten. Alice remained motionless, her eyes fixed on her sister. What else did she say? The attorney pressed. Elizabeth hesitated again, her voice trembling. She said it was complicated, that I wouldn't understand. After a while, I stopped asking. The tension in the courtroom was palpable. Meredith glanced at Alice, who finally broke her stillness, leaning toward her attorney and whispering something. The exchange was brief, but the strain on Alice's face was unmistakable. Miss Morgan, the prosecutor interjected during cross-examination, you've testified that you stopped questioning your sister about financial irregularities. Did you take any further action? Elizabeth shook her head. No, I didn't know what to do. She was my sister. And did you personally witness her engaging in any illegal activity? Elizabeth hesitated, then shook her head again. No, I just suspected. Thank you, the prosecutor said, his tone dismissive as he returned to his seat. As Elizabeth stepped down, Meredith struggled to maintain her composure. Elizabeth's testimony didn't confirm Alice's guilt, but it didn't absolve her either. It added another layer of complexity, a fracture in the Morgan family's bond that mirrored Meredith's own disquiet. She called for a brief recess, retreating to her chambers as the courtroom emptied. Alone, she sat at her desk, staring at the photo of her and Alice as teenagers. The edges of the picture were worn, and the faces within seemed like echoes of a different life. Alice had been the daring one, always chasing big dreams, while Meredith had been the planner, the careful one. They'd balanced each other once. How had it all gone so wrong? A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. It was her clerk again, carrying a folder. Judge Shaw, the prosecution submitted an additional exhibit for your review before the next session. Meredith nodded and took the folder. The contents inside made her stomach drop. The exhibit included a detailed analysis of the emails presented by the prosecution. At first glance, they seemed to confirm Alice's guilt, a clear trail of instructions and authorizations tied to the embezzlement. But as Meredith read further, she noticed an anomaly. The timestamps on several key emails didn't align with Alice's schedule during that period. One email was sent during a time when Alice had been on a flight, confirmed by her travel records. Her pulse quickened. The evidence, so damning on the surface, now seemed less certain. If the emails had been manipulated, it raised a critical question. Who would go to such lengths to frame Alice? She leaned back in her chair, her thoughts racing. Could it be Arthur Davies, the CFO who claimed to have resigned over ethical concerns? Or was it someone else entirely? Meredith's mind churned with possibilities, each one more troubling than the last. When court resumed, Meredith kept her findings to herself, waiting for the defense's turn to address the emails. Alice's attorney, however, seemed unaware of the discrepancies, continuing to argue broadly that the emails were forged without presenting concrete evidence. Meredith's gaze shifted to Alice, who sat with a mixture of defiance and exhaustion. Did she know about the inconsistencies, or was she as much in the dark as her defense team? As the day drew to a close, Meredith called Alice to the stand again. She needed to hear the truth, or as close to it as Alice could give. Alice, Meredith began, her voice steady but firm. You testified that you trusted others to handle financial matters, but the prosecution's evidence includes emails directly implicating you. Can you explain these? Alice hesitated, her gaze flickering between Meredith and her attorney. I didn't write those emails, she said quietly. I know how it looks, but I didn't. Then who did? Meredith pressed. Alice's shoulders sagged. I don't know, but someone wanted me to take the fall. As Alice stepped down, Meredith felt the weight of the case pressing down on her like never before. The inconsistencies in the evidence pointed to deeper corruption, but uncovering the truth would require careful navigation. Alone in her chambers, Meredith reviewed the case files again, determined to find the thread that would unravel the lies. She owed it to justice, to the court, and perhaps to the memory of the friendship that once meant everything to her. The day began with a stillness that felt unnatural. The courtroom, though filled to capacity, was eerily quiet, as if everyone present knew they were inching closer to something significant. Judge Meredith Shaw adjusted her robe, her expression composed, but inside, unease brooded. The previous night's revelations had left her restless. She had reviewed the prosecution's evidence until the early hours of the morning, scrutinizing every detail, every anomaly, searching for answers that refused to fully reveal themselves. "All rise," the bailiff called, snapping Meredith out of her thoughts. The gallery stood as Meredith entered, her steps deliberate, her presence commanding. "Court is now in session," she announced, her voice cutting through the silence. "Defense, you may proceed." Alice sat at the defense table, her posture tense, her eyes shadowed by fatigue. Meredith couldn't help but notice how worn Alice looked. The sharp, confident woman from their youth seemed buried under layers of stress and uncertainty. Alice's attorney stood, shuffling his papers. His confidence from the early days of the trial had frayed, replaced by a strained resolve. "Your Honor," he began, "the defense would like to recall Mr. Arthur Davies to the stand." The prosecutor's eyebrows shot up, but he said nothing, clearly curious to see where this would lead. Arthur Davies entered the courtroom, his demeanor as polished as before. He took the oath with practiced ease, settling into the witness chair. The defense attorney stepped forward. "Mr. Davies, during your testimony, you stated that you resigned from Ellison Enterprises due to ethical concerns. Is that correct?" "Yes," Davies replied, his tone steady. "And yet," the attorney continued, "we have evidence that suggests your resignation coincided with a significant payout from the company, a payout authorized by Miss Morgan. Care to explain that?" Davies' composure faltered for the briefest moment, a flicker of uncertainty passing across his face. "That payment was part of my severance package," he said smoothly. "It was agreed upon during my departure." The defense attorney leaned in slightly. "A severance package totaling $500,000 for a CFO resigning over ethical disagreements? That seems unusually generous." The courtroom murmured, and Meredith brought her gavel down sharply. "Order in the court." The defense pressed on. "Mr. Davies, isn't it true that this payout was hush money? That Miss Morgan paid you to cover up discrepancies you were responsible for?" Davies' jaw tightened. "No, that's not true." The defense attorney stepped back, holding up a copy of the bank transfer records. "Then explain why this payment was routed through an offshore account, an account that's also linked to several transactions flagged in this case." Meredith watched Davies closely. The man's calm veneer was cracking, his answers growing more clipped. Something about his testimony felt rehearsed, as though he had prepared for predictable questions but hadn't anticipated this line of inquiry. As the defense attorney continued to press, Davies' responses became evasive. "I don't recall the specifics," he said at one point, "and that's not how I remember it," at another. The jury watched him with increasing skepticism. Meredith's mind churned. Davies had seemed confident, even righteous, during his initial testimony, but now he resembled someone cornered, his words carefully chosen to avoid incriminating himself. The prosecutor rose for cross-examination, attempting to salvage Davies' credibility. "Mr. Davies," he began, "you've testified that your role as CFO included overseeing all financial operations. Is that correct?" "Yes," Davies said, his voice steadier now. "And during your tenure, did Miss Morgan ever instruct you to falsify records or misappropriate funds?" "No, she did not." The prosecutor nodded, pacing slowly. "In your opinion, is Miss Morgan capable of such actions?" Davies hesitated. It was a subtle pause, but in the charged atmosphere of the courtroom, it felt monumental. "I can't say for certain," he replied finally. The prosecutor's tone sharpened. "So you're not willing to rule out the possibility?" Davies shifted in his seat. "I'm saying I don't know." Meredith's gavel struck the bench. "The witness will answer directly or refrain from speculation," she said, her voice firm. The prosecutor stepped back, visibly frustrated. "No further questions, Your Honor." As Davies left the stand, Alice's attorney called their final witness, an IT specialist who had reviewed the emails presented by the prosecution. The specialist, a bespectacled woman in her late 30s, explained how metadata and digital files could be altered. She highlighted several anomalies in the emails attributed to Alice, including discrepancies in timestamps and IP addresses that didn't match her usual locations. "Based on my analysis," the specialist concluded. It's likely these emails were either fabricated or heavily edited. The defense attorney seized on this. So you're saying the prosecution's key evidence is unreliable? The specialist nodded. That's correct. But the prosecutor, during cross-examination, pointed out the lack of direct proof linking the alterations to anyone else. Can you say with certainty who tampered with these emails? He asked. No, the specialist admitted. I can only confirm the inconsistencies. As the court adjourned for the day, Meredith remained at the bench, her thoughts heavy. The inconsistencies in the case were glaring, but no one seemed capable of threading them together. The prosecution's evidence was flawed, but the defense's arguments lacked concrete proof of a setup. Back in her chambers, Meredith reviewed the IT specialist's findings alongside the emails and financial records. The timeline didn't add up. If Alice had been on a flight during one of the key email exchanges, as her travel records showed, someone else had to be involved. Her clerk knocked softly, peeking inside. Judge Shaw, are you staying late again? Meredith glanced up, her eyes tired. Yes, I need to sort through this. The clerk hesitated. There's something else. The defense filed a motion to subpoena Mr. Davies' personal financial records. Meredith's brow furrowed. When? An hour ago. It's waiting for your review. Meredith opened the folder her clerk handed her. The motion argued that Davies' financial records could reveal additional connections to the offshore accounts flagged in the embezzlement case. She signed the order, her pen pressing harder than usual. As the courthouse emptied and the city outside grew dark, Meredith remained in her chambers, poring over documents. She couldn't shake the feeling that the truth was closer than it seemed, just out of reach. The picture was coming together, but the final piece connecting Davies' role, the emails, and the financial trail had yet to fall into place. Leaning back in her chair, she glanced at the old photo of her and Alice again. Her younger self smiled back, full of hope and faith in the world. But the woman staring now had learned that trust, once broken, was hard to rebuild. Tomorrow, she thought, something would give. It had to. The courtroom was alive with a sense of expectation the following morning. The motion to subpoena Arthur Davies' financial records had been approved overnight, and the defense wasted no time in presenting the new evidence. The tension was palpable as the clerk handed out copies of the records to the attorneys, jury, and Judge Meredith Shaw. Meredith adjusted her glasses and began reviewing the documents. Her focus sharpened as she noticed a pattern, large deposits into Davies' accounts that coincided with the timeline of the alleged embezzlement. The amounts were staggeringly close to the sums missing from the Hope Haven Foundation. Offshore accounts, thinly veiled under shell companies, linked Davies to transactions that directly implicated him in financial fraud. Your Honor, Alice's attorney began, his tone sharp and confident for the first time in days. We present clear evidence that Mr. Davies, not Miss Morgan, orchestrated the financial discrepancies. These documents show that he received substantial payments through channels linked to the foundation's funds. The jury leaned forward, engrossed. The defense attorney continued. Mr. Davies testified that he resigned due to ethical concerns, yet these records suggest otherwise. He wasn't leaving a corrupt situation. He was covering his tracks. The prosecutor objected. Speculation, Your Honor. Meredith held up a hand. Overruled. The defense may proceed. The defense attorney turned to the jury. This man's financial dealings, coupled with inconsistencies in the emails attributed to Miss Morgan, point to one conclusion. Someone framed my client, and that someone is Arthur Davies. The prosecution had no choice but to recall Davies to the stand. His polished demeanor was gone, replaced by visible unease as the defense tore through the evidence. Mr. Davies, the defense attorney said, pacing in front of the witness stand, can you explain why these payments, totaling over $1.5 million, were deposited into your account during the same period as the alleged embezzlement? Davies' mouth opened, but no words came out. Finally, he stammered. They were, consulting fees. For what consulting work? The attorney pressed. Davies' face reddened. Private projects. Private projects tied to offshore accounts associated with the stolen foundation funds. Davies faltered, his silence damning. The defense attorney stepped back, turning to the jury. This is the man the prosecution has relied on as their key witness. The evidence against him is overwhelming, while the case against my client continues to unravel. When Davies stepped down, his credibility in shreds, the defense called Alice back to the stand for a final statement. She walked with a steadiness that hadn't been there before, her head held high. "Miss Morgan," her attorney began, "after all the evidence presented, what do you want the court to know?" Alice took a deep breath. "I trusted the wrong people. I should have been more diligent, but I didn't steal from the foundation. I've spent my life trying to help people, and I wouldn't betray the trust of those who needed us the most." Her voice broke slightly as she added, "I was careless, yes, but I am not a thief." The jury deliberated for hours, their faces tense with the weight of the decision. When they returned, the foreperson handed the verdict to Meredith. The courtroom held its breath as she read the paper. "In the case of the state of Illinois versus Alice Morgan, we find the defendant not guilty." Gasps filled the room, followed by muffled cheers from the gallery. Alice slumped in her seat, tears streaming down her face. Meredith banged her gavel. "Order in the court." The foreperson continued, "We recommend further investigation into Mr. Arthur Davies." Within days, Davies was arrested. Additional evidence, including corroborating witness testimony and forensic analysis of his accounts, revealed that he had orchestrated the scheme to divert suspicion onto Alice while siphoning funds for his personal gain. The media covered his downfall extensively, painting him as the true villain of the case. Alone in her chambers after the verdict, Meredith sat with the photo of her and Alice once again. This time, she allowed herself to smile faintly. Justice had been served, but it had come at a cost. She had seen the toll the trial had taken on Alice and on herself. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. It was Alice, standing hesitantly in the doorway. "May I come in?" Meredith nodded. "Of course." Alice stepped inside, her expression a mixture of relief and lingering pain. "I just wanted to thank you for being fair. It wasn't easy." "No," Meredith admitted, "but it was the right thing to do." Alice looked at the photo on the desk. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" Meredith nodded. "Farther than I thought possible." There was a long pause before Alice spoke again. "I hope maybe we can start over." Meredith met her gaze, seeing the sincerity in her friend's eyes. "It'll take time," she said honestly, "but I'd like that." Alice smiled faintly, and for the first time in years, Meredith felt the faint stirrings of hope. Alice returned to the foundation, dedicating herself to rebuilding its reputation and expanding its reach. Meredith continued her work on the bench, her resolve to seek justice stronger than ever. Their paths no longer ran parallel, but they intersected in ways both women had thought were lost forever. In the end, the truth had prevailed, and while the scars of the trial would linger, they also served as a reminder. The past may shape us, but it doesn't have to define us.